Hi there, and welcome to Custom Wood and Restoration. I'm Matthew, and today I'm going to show you a woodblock tabletop we made at home. I'll talk you through how we did it, the tools we used, and the things we learned along the way. There are lots of really great maker channels on YouTube. In fact, we got the idea for this project from one of those. But many of them seem to have beautiful workshops and lots of tools and space. What I want to show you is that you don't need all of those things to create great projects and to have great results. If you find this video useful, please do subscribe, follow us on Instagram, visit the website where you'll find some of the other projects we've worked on. You'll also find my email address if you want to drop me a note and ask either questions about today's video or other projects you might like to see us tackle, any advice, any tips that you've got that we can then share with everyone else on the channel. So with that, all the links will be in the description below. With that, let's move on with today's project. This table is made of blocks of wood cut across the grain into 2-inch lengths and then stood on end in a mould into which we'll pour epoxy resin to bind them together. Here you can see that process part way through. We used a bandsaw with a guide set up so we could just run the pieces through quickly, one after the other, like this. So I've got the bandsaw all set up here, ready to go. I've got a block of wood to show you how this whole process works. And here I've marked off actually 2 inches from the end of the wood. I marked it off, measured it, and then just ran around with a square, drawing the pencil line across on each edge. So if I was going to use a handsaw, I could clamp that to the bench or put it in a vise, clamp it to anything. In fact, garden table I've used often in the past. Could cut this off, and then that would be a first block. We've used something like 300, 350 in this table. It's almost about 4 feet diameter, so it's a big table. I'm going to use the bandsaw, and here I've got set up a fence or a guide. I'm just going to take these out of the way so they don't get involved in the process. I've got the guide set up, made sure the piece of wood is straight, got my G-clamps on there. I'm just going to turn the bandsaw on and show you what it looks like to cut one of these, how easy it is to cut the blocks using this tool. Now, what's really important with a bandsaw is you keep your fingers well away from that blade when it's running. It'll have them off in no time at all. Incredibly powerful tool. Like all tools, respect it, be aware of how dangerous they can be, and you'll be fine. Let the blade run down before getting your fingers anywhere near removing the pieces of wood. You can see here I've cut a little bit proud. I did measure this, clearly didn't measure it well enough, but the point is cut it very, very fair, very square, and that's the 2-inch line, so it's probably about 2 1/8 inches. So if I'd done that, done my test piece, if I'd got my measuring stick out beforehand, that's actually saying about 2 1/16 inches, which just goes to show these measuring tapes aren't all that accurate. If I use the scale on my square, that also says about 2 1/16 inches, so maybe my marking wasn't that accurate. So that's a good lesson. Mark twice, cut once. That's it. We just did that lots and lots of times to get the blocks to stand all up in the former that you'll see in the video going forward. You could use a handsaw, beats going to the gym, or a circular saw. Just be careful to get the ends square or you'll have a lot of sanding to do later. Once the pieces were all laid out in the mould, we poured the epoxy. We made a mistake here and did the pour all in one go. This allowed the wood to float up in the epoxy, making for an entertaining game of whack-a-mole while it's set. When you do it, mix 1/3 of the epoxy first, pour it and let it cure for 12 hours, and then complete the pour. This way the blocks won't float. There are lots of tips around eliminating bubbles from epoxy when you're working with raw wood, and I've put some useful videos in the description below. Now let's take a look at the table when it's set. So here's the tabletop I talked about earlier. You can see we've laid up the blocks. Let me just bring the camera a bit closer. So we've laid up the blocks out on the sheet, poured epoxy resin over it, and then we've sanded it back to try and get a true finish as possible. We're going to pour some glass cast 50, which is a type of sort of self-leveling resin that gives you the sort of thing you use on penny floors, that gives you a glassy finish and without having to do anything more to it. But as we poured the resin last time, and we ended up with some bubbles in it. So what I'm going to do today is just clean out some of these bubbles using a drill. You can see some of the smaller ones, like here for example. The resin won't settle into that neatly, it'll leave us with a mark. We've got some other smaller ones here, so what I'm going to do is drill those out and clean them up, ready to pour the final coat of resin. So here I've got my drill plugged in. I've chosen a big drill bit, and I'm going to drill out some of these smaller bubbles. So now I've been across the whole tabletop and I've drilled out these little small holes where the epoxy won't sink into them because they're too small. So I've drilled them out to make them all open so that the epoxy sinks into them. Now what I'm going to do, I've got my cake siding. Last time I did this I tried using self-adhesive roof sealant tape, which was a disaster because it sticks really well. So if you want to fix your roof, get that stuff, put it on your roof. Do not use it where you're going to have to take it off again. In order to apply this to the side of the table, I'm going to use just some normal, in this case clear, but silicone sealant. I'm going to run a single bead around the edge of the table, and then I'm going to lay the cake topping around it. This is 10 metres, about 10 centimetres or 4 inches deep, very thin. You can buy it for about £4 or something off Amazon, about $6. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn the camera off while I do, because I'm probably going to wrestle with it, and I'll show you what it looks like in the end, tell you what problems I've ran up against. And then I'm probably going to put a cargo strap around the edge of this, a ratchet strap, just to make sure that it really holds that close. So let's see how that goes. I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, here we go. I've got the end free. Let's see how we get on. Well, touch wood, that seems to have been fairly effective. I need the load strap to squidge the sealant out from around the edge, and of course I forgot to bring a pair of scissors, so I'm going to have to go and get those now and cut this clean. But let me just finish that up and I'll show you what it looks like. Right, that didn't go too badly at all. So having applied this sort of this cake stand, whatever it's called, cake edging, around the edge of the table, using the sort of the bathroom sealant, the silicone sealant. I then went around again and sort of smushed it out with my hands to make a really good seal, and that meant I was able to take out more of the sealant, so I ended up with a little bit of a bulge running around the edge of the table. Having done that, I just asked my dearly beloved to give me a hand putting this ratchet strap around the edge of the table, and we've tensioned that up, and I'm going to leave this the bathroom sealant to set there for about 30 minutes or so, to go off a little bit while I go away and get the epoxy, the glass coat ready to pour, and then we'll come back and show you that pouring. So here I've got the glass cast resin that I'm going to use to finish off the tabletop. I already applied some previously, and I didn't read the instructions properly and seal the top of the table, which is why air then came out of the wood, which I sanded it back to bare wood to get it completely flat. Air came out of the wood and I ended up with those bubbles in the finished coat. Now if you watch the video that Easy Composites, and I'll put the links in the description below, if you watch the video on their website, they do explain how to do this. As usual, I didn't read the instructions before diving into the deep end, so I've had to do some remedial work which I've showed you already. But these get mixed 2 to 1 by volume, and I've got some leftovers here. I'm going to put those in the mix too. I don't have a nice clean clear mixing tub like they have in their videos, but I have got a 5-gallon bucket, so I'll be using that, and a bit of stick that came with some wood that I ordered for a stool that I made recently, that you'll see in one of my other videos and on my website. Again, links in the description below. So get this mixed up, and then I'll show it pouring onto the table, and I'll be using a hairdryer to heat the surface of the resin to encourage the bubbles to bubble out, and hopefully it will wind up with a nice clean, glassy, clear surface. So here I've mixed up a great big bucket of that glass coat, clear coat epoxy, simply by stirring it in different directions, stirring it around in circles and then across like this. That's ready to pour now, so I'm just going to do that, and then we'll smooth it across the surface using my stirring stick. Now I'm going to take my smooth edge and just scrape this across the table. Just spreading nice and evenly, making sure it reaches the edges. It's supposed to be self-leveling this, so as long as I get it to the edges, it should then level itself up, flow back to the middle where it needs to. Be careful not to push the edges away from the table. There we are, nearly done. That. So you can see it's sort of spread broadly evenly across the table. It's a bit deeper here, but that'll level itself out. Now what I'm going to do is go and get a hairdryer and just wave it back and forth across the epoxy to warm it up. That will help with the self-leveling, and also drive the bubbles out. Well, that's it for now. It's about 3:15 in the afternoon. I've used the hairdryer on the surface, and it's pretty smooth. So now we're going to leave it to set. It needs to set for about 24 hours to fully cure. Probably give it at least 48, and then we'll see what the surface has come out like. And it's quite possible it will need a final fine sanding and then a buffing up to the final finish. So we'll leave this, try not to touch it, try not to have anything land on it, and see how we go. So it's now a couple of days later. The surface is set hard, so what I'm going to do now is take the ratchet strap off and peel this film from the edge of the table, and then we'll sand the meniscus lip off, give it a bit of a flatting across the whole surface with some fine sandpaper, and then polish it up with a buffing pad. So here goes. There we are, easy as that. So that's a win for the cake siding. So for any of the rest of you, anyone else out there doing a project like this where you need to keep epoxy resin in one place around a smooth edge, particularly a circular edge where it's hard to put sort of fences up and keep that epoxy in, use cake cider. Brilliant, who knew? So I've got my air sander set up again. I've got a 120 grit sheet on the bottom here. Any scratches I now put in this surface I'm going to have to get out again. So this is the final finished surface. I'm just going to give it a bit of flattening, bit of polishing. Don't want to put any big scratches in there. Use a relatively fine grit to begin with. I've got 80, I've got 50. Both of those I think will be too harsh. There's a little lip here, just like when you, look at the water in a jar or something. It forms a meniscus, goes up at the edges. It's exactly what this epoxy is set to against that barrier that I put. So I'm just going to sand that ridge off so we've got a flat edge. Sand the rest of the table off, just to get rid of the alkyd bloom that you get on the top of epoxy when it dries. And then I'll put a rolled edge on using a router and a edge following bit, and finally give it a final polish with some polishing compound and a lamb's wool bonnet fitted on here. So here we go. Just checking periodically with my fingers to see the state of that ridge. Is it down flat, flush with the rest of the table? It's all too easy to tilt and tip with these sanders and to end up putting a gash in the surface or rounding the corner off a bit too much. That's less of an issue, more if I tip into the surface when I don't need to. So just keep checking with my fingers. Now you can see I've done the first pass with the orbital sander, with the air orbital, and that's put a bit of a sort of a dusty finish on this, which will now rub back. It's taken out some of the high spots, little bubbles and still nicks and things that are coming out. This is what you get when you don't have a workshop and you try and do this stuff outside in your backyard. So trying to get the best result we can under the circumstances. So you can see I've sanded this back. I've also just scraped away some of the leftover bathroom sealant from around the edge. Now I'm going to run a belt sander around the edge like that, to take off any excess that sort of dribbled down the edges and was stopped by the bath sealant. And remember that, fence I had made out of cake siding. Take that off, make sure it's nice and smooth, and then we can get to just finishing this top off nicely, putting a bit of a rounded edge on here with a router, and finishing the table off. I've now been across the tabletop with 120 grit. and then with 240 grit using the Air Orbital Sander. This is lovely and smooth feeling now, although you can see it's now quite a cloudy finish. That's because it's got that sanded finish on it. So the next thing for this finish is to use wet and dry sandpaper, so a bit of water, a bit of regular hand soap, solid soap, bar soap, to help the sandpaper slip across the surface, and sand this down really super fine. But before I do that, I want to edge the table, and I'm going to do that using, I don't know whether you can see this, how clearly you can see this. This is a 1/4 inch round fitting that I've got on here. This is a router, and it's just got this. It's got a bearing on the end of this that will roll around the edge of the table, like so, and enable me just to take the router around the edge of the table. Without having to have a special gantry, a special setup to do it. The other way of doing it, if you want to get an absolutely perfect, want to be sure of an absolutely perfect circle, would be to take a point off the centre of the table and use a piece of iron bar or something, attach it to the router, and then you could use that as if it's a big set of compasses. But we've already done that to get this table round in the first place, so I'm just going to use this to finish the edge up. And now, besides looking like it's Christmas out here, it's going to take some sweeping up, I can tell you. We've now got a nice smooth rolled edge on the edge of the table here. That's going to make it much more pleasant to sit on, to use. Rest your elbow on, you're not going to get that jagged edge in there. So I'll tidy this mess up and then I'll do some rubbing down of wet and dry, and I'll show you what that looks like when I've got to that just sort of pre-polish finish. Hi again. We've now let the table set for quite some time now, and today I'm going to finish off this surface. So we used the orbital sander with some orbital sander with some dry sandpaper on it, and that was about a 240 grit. So we're going to go gradually up the grit grades, finer and finer sandpaper to get this closer and closer to sort of polished surface, and then we're going to use this buffing compound that's been made especially for epoxy finishes, and we're going to use a lamb's wool buffer on the Air Orbital Sander. So in terms of sandpaper, I've got here, it's wet and dry sandpaper, so I'll be using water with a bit of soap to let it slip across the tabletop. I've got a 320 grit. You can see this is what it looks like, silicon carbide paper I think it's called, yep. 320 grit, don't know whether you can read that in there. And then I've got some 1200 grit that I picked up from the store a couple of days ago. I've got myself a rubbing block, this is just cork, and a tray, plastic tray here that I can put the water in so I can just work on the surface. So I'll get stuck into that, show you what it looks like. So here we are. I'm going to, this is just ordinary block soap, a bit of water, put that on the table. Seems counterintuitive if you're not used to working with paintwork and so on, put water on what you're about to sand, but that's what this paper's good for. Splash some water on the table, put a bit of soap on there, make it slippery so that the sandpaper doesn't grab and get the best finish possible. And then simply, using two hands, keeping the block quite flat, still feel it's grabbing a bit, so you can rub the block on the soap. There we are. A bit more water. As I carry on across the table using this technique, keep feeling it with my fingers. Is it smoother? Is it consistently smooth across the surface? Is it smoother than the bits I haven't sanded? Continue doing that, changing up the grit. So at the minute I'm using 320 grit. I've got up to the 1200 grit. It's quite a big step, but I wasn't able to find any paper in between. You normally use a 600 or 700 grit, I guess, in between those. You can see it's starting to come up quite smooth. And if I show you what that looks like from the surface there. Oh, there's the microphone. And if I show you what that looks like from the surface here, you can see it's starting to come up clearer. Let's just smush the sanding away. It's quite smooth there. So I've done the wet and dry sanding now. Now it's time to do the final buffing. You can see it's still quite opaque looking. So we'll see if we can get that up with the buffing tool. I've got the paste here and an applicator pad, otherwise known as an old pair of socks. Dip that in there, smear the grinding, or the buffing paste rather, on the surface, and circular motions, and then starting with the buffer set on quite a slow speed. Let's just see what we get. So I've just spent about 5–10 minutes with the buffer here, just on this side of the table. I think you should be able to see the difference. If you see the reflection of the fence panels in this side of the table versus the other side of the table, it's still quite opaque. So I'm quite happy with this finish. It's worked really well, and I recommend that you try it. One thing I would say is, when you've got your workpiece set out, do make sure you try and get, if you're doing something like this in particular, and I spoke about some of the challenges we had playing whack-a-mole, pushing the blocks down into the table as it floated up on the epoxy. Also, we were working on a tabletop that was slightly smaller than this, and we ended up getting a bit of a bow in the finish. So the clear coat is, or the glass coat rather, is thicker in the middle than it is at the edges, and that's led to a bit of opacity in the finish when you're looking down onto the wood. But in general, and I'll show you this edge piece in a minute, it's come up really beautifully with the end grain. You can see you can get a really nice gloss finish on it. So as I said, I wanted to show you just exactly how clear and what a great end grain you get. So this is bouncing up and down a bit, but you can see the end grain of the wood through that really clearly, and that's the polished up glass coat. So that's a really beautiful finish. And if I show you the whole of the table, still got some tools on it, still working on it, you can quite clearly see there's a line across the middle here where I've done the polishing on this side and not on the other side yet. So I'll get to that, but hopefully that's given you some ideas as to sort of things you might be able to do. So you don't have to have this great big air polisher. I've actually got an electric orbital sander. You could do it by hand, it would just take longer. But my electrical orbital sander's had so much use on it, the head started to wobble a bit. This is why I tend to use this one. So, there you have it, all done. Finished polishing, and now it's ready to use. Now, hope you found this useful and interesting. Please do put comments, questions in the section below. Any requests for things you'd like me to look at in future videos, that'd be great. If you like this, do click subscribe, follow us on Instagram, and go and have a look at the website. There are some other projects that we've done there. We haven't filmed all of them yet. Let me know which you'd like to see next, and if you've got any questions, you can also email me, and my email address is on the website as well. So until next time, happy crafting and stay safe. I'll see you next time.